Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 8th of October. I'm Andrew Wilson, and welcome to the Full Scottish. This afternoon I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 592 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our two guests, and then together we will take a look at the past week's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Volodymyr Zelensky has spoken about the situation in Israel, drawing parallels with the war in Ukraine by stating that Israel's right to self-defence is unquestionable. He said his government had set up an operational headquarters to aid any Ukrainians in Israel. Officials have estimated that about 15,000 Ukrainian refugees have fled to Israel. Netanyahu has consistently refused to supply any weapons to Kyiv. A United Russia Party official in the Russian-held town of Novokakhovka in the Kherson Oblast was killed in a car explosion yesterday, the Russian-installed regional governor said. Dmitry Medvedev, Russia's former leader, has called for a civil war in the United States, as he says a civil war would be the only thing that could stop America's manic passion for sparking conflicts everywhere on the planet. Train traffic between North Korea and Russia has dramatically increased after the recent summit between leaders Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, indicating a likely transfer of arms, according to a new report by Washington-based analysts. High-resolution satellite imagery reveals at least 70 freight cars in North Korea's border Tumangang rail facility. The Belgorod governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov, said a man was killed in shelling of the village of Urazovo in Russia's Belgorod Oblast. Mikhail Ulyanov, Russia's permanent representative to international organizations in Vienna, posted on X that Russia is planning to revoke ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. One woman was killed and two more people injured in Russian shelling of the village of Bilanki in the Zaporizhia Oblast. The Odessa regional governor, Ole Kieper, has said that Russian forces launched an overnight missile strike on Ukraine's southern Odessa Oblast, damaging port infrastructure early yesterday. 4 people were wounded in the strike, which hit a boarding house and a portside grain facility. And Russia's defense ministry has claimed it destroyed 2 Ukrainian S-200 anti-aircraft missiles, thwarting attacks on the Crimean Peninsula yesterday. Their claims have not yet been verified. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined by a regular contributor this afternoon. Linda Fabiani served as the SNP member of our Scottish Parliament when representing East Kilbride from 1999 until she retired at the Scottish election in 2021. When she retired, Linda was the Deputy Presiding Officer of the Parliament. Linda, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Absolutely fine. Thank you very much, Andrew. Hello, everyone.
It's great to see you, and we're also lucky enough to be joined by Paul McLennan MSP, who's been the MSP for East Lothian since 2021. Previously, Paul served as a local councillor for the Dunbar and East Linton multi-member ward on East Lothian Council and was both the SNP group leader and the council leader from 2007 till 2012. Paul was appointed as Minister for Housing in our Scottish Government in March 2023. Paul, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Good afternoon, Andrew. I'm good. In this still a wet Sunday after a wet weekend.
Dreich is not the word. You're absolutely right, Paul.
Yeah.
It's great to see you. Thank you for joining us. Now, this morning, as Israelis struggled to comprehend the scale of yesterday's attack, the possibility of an Israeli ground invasion into Gaza and wider conflagration with Hezbollah in Lebanon loomed large. As the United Nations Security Council prepared to go into emergency session later today, and the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres urged maximum restraint, the Iranian-backed armed group Hezbollah said it had fired rockets and artillery into northern Israel in solidarity with the Palestinian people. As the scale of the deaths and injuries on both sides from the first day of conflict became apparent, the official Israel death toll stood at 250 dead, while more than 313 Palestinians were reported to have been killed. Yesterday, backed by a barrage of rockets, hundreds of Hamas operatives broke out of Gaza and fanned out into 22 Israeli towns, shooting at civilians in an attack that stunned Israel. And as Israel prepares today for a likely ground invasion of Gaza, the Israeli cabinet announced it had cut off all electricity, fuel, and goods going into Gaza. Israel struck 426 targets in Gaza last night, the IDF said, flattening residential buildings and giant explosions. That included a 14-story tower that held dozens of apartments, as well as Hamas offices in central Gaza City. Israeli forces fired a warning just before, and no casualties were reported in that strike. A senior spokesman from Hamas said it was not attacking civilians, despite claims by Amnesty International and other groups. Fighters from Hamas's armed wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, yesterday had launched an unprecedented incursion into territories around the Gaza Strip, capturing at least 100 Israelis, according to Hamas. Agnes Kamelard, Amnesty International's Secretary General, said yesterday, "We are deeply alarmed at the mounting civilian deaths in Gaza, Israel and the occupied West Bank, and urgently call on all parties to the conflict to abide by international law and make every effort to avoid further civilian bloodshed. Under international humanitarian law, all sides in a conflict have a clear obligation to protect the lives of civilians caught up in the hostilities." Responding earlier today while speaking to Al Jazeera, the senior Hamas spokesperson Osama Hamadan said his group was not attacking civilians. He said, "You have to differentiate between settlers and civilians. Settlers attacked Palestinians. We hope that Amnesty International has the humility to send us more weapons to attack only the soldiers." And this morning, it's also reported by Al Jazeera that an Egyptian policeman has opened fire on tourists in the Mediterranean city of Alexandria, killing at least 2 Israelis and 1 Egyptian, according to local media reports. So firstly, Linda, coming to you first, this is horrible but probably predictable news from the Middle East this weekend. How do you think the UN and the wider international community should respond?
Well, I mean, I understand their current response. It's a quick response. They're quoting international law, and the reality is there's people getting killed, and it's going to get worse. And of course, you know, when you look at Gaza and you look at Israel, it's going to be disproportionate. The Palestinian folks, it's horrendous what could happen to them, and you know, it will be justified by Israel and the international community because of what they call a terrorist attack. I was stunned by it, that, you know, how it happened. But I think what the UN has to do and what the international community has to do is recognise the history of this. You know, when you look at, you know, how Israel has in fact expanded its borders, how the international community has accepted that so often. When you look at Netanyahu's government, the rhetoric that comes from it, I think there's got to be, I just want a stop to the violence. I don't want anybody else hurt, of course not. But if this is not properly discussed, we're never going to have what was always called the 2-state solution. We might put a lid on it for a while, but it will blow up again. And I wonder, I was reading some of the reports about how Israeli intelligence wasn't able to predict this. You know, that Israeli intelligence operation that is so lauded and applauded and has been for decades now. And I wonder if this will have a very adverse effect on the Netanyahu government, because they've had such a hard time lately because of some of the justice reforms and everything they have forced through. There's been loads of demonstrations. So with what has now happened, it could go one of 2 ways. The Israeli people could decide they've got to go all out to crush Palestine and Gaza, or they could be saying, "Now, wait a minute, let's just get this to stop." The way that Netanyahu has taken us is probably not useful for the longer term. So I think there's an awful lot has to be taken on board by the UN, but overall we want the killing to stop.
Thanks, Linda. Now, Paul, Linda talks about the history of this situation, and I was reminded this morning that an intifada is nowadays a key concept in Arabic usage, referring to a legitimate uprising against oppression. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there was the first Intifada between 1987 and 1993. There was the Al-Aqsa Intifada, which began in late September 2000 and ran until around 2005. There was unrest in Jerusalem in 2014, which is sometimes referred to as an Intifada. And then between 2015 and 2016, there was the Al-Quds Intifada, or the Jerusalem Intifada, which was an escalation in the conflict over those 2 years. So, Paul, thinking of the history and either 3 or 4 Intifada already between Israel and Palestine, do you think is the international community strong enough to work effectively to, as Linda says, stop civilian deaths, but also to permanently secure peace in the Middle East?
I think Linda's right, Andrew. We will see this again come up every so often. There's always that underlying conflict that's there, and I think this kind of demonstrates the failure of international diplomacy and the seriousness that it's taken on. And I think the international community now has to pick this up and realise the situation it's in. We are talking, even just in the last few days, mostly civilian deaths, 500 civilian deaths, and it just seems to be accepted in the international community. This happens in Palestine, and it can't be acceptable. So this is where we've got to see the international community, I think, take this issue more seriously than it has over the last number of years. We're talking about innocent civilians on both sides being killed here, so there takes that, and I think it's almost in the background. There's been some kind of rapprochement. I suppose that, the United States has been talking to Saudi Arabia, talking about possibly recognising Israel. There's been other discussions going on around about smaller Gulf states recognising Israel. But the international community has to put more pressure on Israel to bring them to the table and have serious discussions. And comes back to the point that Linda mentioned about the two-state solution. We've never had a serious discussion around about the two-state solution now for a number of years. And we've seen Israel encroach more and more in Palestine, and obviously more and more settlers, illegal settlers, coming into Palestine itself. So we need to see serious international diplomacy at this stage. We need to stop the fighting, but we need to see serious international diplomacy, because if not, we'll come back here time and time and time and time again. So it's really up to the main international, and I hope United Nations take this very seriously, take it very strongly, and try and bring the two sides to the table, because we'll continue to see innocent civilians being killed if we don't.
Thanks, Paul. And there was one thing, Linda, I was going to ask you. Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday described the situation as a war, and indeed the Israeli Defense Force has mobilized and has called up its reserves, which are quite considerable. If it is a war, as Netanyahu calls it, why do you think Israel was targeting civilians in Gaza City last night, blowing up residential buildings?
Well, they will say that it was a reasonable response to what happened to their own people. And it isn't the first time that this has happened. This has happened before over the years. All the different times that you talked about, Andrew, there was different intifadas, different incursions, and the name of the particular refugee camp escapes me at the moment, but there was a terrible, terrible loss of death in one of the refugee camps. And then there's all the times that the Israelis have just gone and flattened residences as well, as part of their land expansion. But I mean, my real concern about Netanyahu immediately calling this a war, and I can understand, that kind of language when it's a perceived incursion, and people are killed, which is always terrible. But it also, the concern there is, if you call it a war, you start to justify all sorts of different actions. And my real concern is that we will end up with a massacre here beyond a war, a real massacre of Palestinian people. And I think that could potentially happen. That's why I'm so keen for the international community to come together and try to, as Paul said, force Israel to the table to have really serious discussions. And I hope they happen internally in Israel as well. We very often forget that there are Israeli folks who are not happy with the way that some of the land grabbing has been carried on. There are Israeli conscientious objectors to the national service, etc., etc. These people don't get much coverage in the press and in the media, but these people exist. So it would be good if there was internal forcing of Netanyahu to start talking sensibly about the future.
Thanks, Linda. Now then, we'll move on to our next item this afternoon. In Rutherglen and Hamilton West on Thursday, Labour won the by-election, taking over 58% of the vote on a 37% turnout. Labour's Michael Shanks received 17,845 votes, more than double the 8,399 votes received by the SNP's Katie Loudon, but of course that's still less than the Labour candidate in 2019, Jed Killen, secured with 18,545 votes. The Tories and all the others standing lost their deposits. The First Minister, Humza Yousaf, said it was a disappointing night for the SNP, but there were also difficult contextual factors, such as the actions of the former MP Margaret Ferrier and the police investigation into the party's finances playing a part. However, he pledged that the party would reflect, regroup, reorganise and come back stronger. The victory by Labour may not have been unexpected, but the scale of the win, which saw a 20.4% swing from the SNP, was the surprise of the night. The polling expert Mark Diffley told The National that he was not convinced that Yousaf's leadership was a major issue. He said, bearing in mind that this was the perfect by-election for Labour at the perfect time, if they were going to choose any constituency to have a by-election in Scotland, this would pretty much be the one. It's in the Central Belt, it's swayed between Labour and the SNP at every election since 2010, it's gone backwards and forwards, and it's got a real Labour tradition in the seat. He went on to say that there were other factors such as tactical voting and the SNP and Conservatives both having to convince voters of their records after long periods in government, that also played a part in Labour's win. Diffley said another major issue facing the SNP in the by-election was tactical voting, with a collapse in the Tory and Lib Dem votes appearing to be as a result of their votes going to Labour instead. But he said that this may not happen to such a great extent at a general election, with Tory supporters in particular facing a potential dilemma over whether to come back to a rival party which is vying for the keys to Downing Street. So, after the by-election, the march in Edinburgh yesterday being cancelled because of the weather, and the rugby last night, I was tempted to recite Renton's speech from Trainspotting. It's shite being Scottish, we're the lowest of the low, but I'll not. So, there's a lot to digest, and the dust probably hasn't settled yet. Some people have said better to have a bloody nose now, a year out from the general election, when at least you've a little bit of time to fix things, rather than wander into the general election not realising quite how difficult the position is. So firstly, Linda, do you think is that a fair overarching assessment? Better to suffer a bloody nose now than a greater problem at the general election probably next year?
No, I think it's meaningless. I think that's a completely meaningless thing. It's the kind of thing that we all say to try and get a wee bit of comfort from something. I mean, what I would say is I wouldn't make any comment, like that, because I don't think on a by-election with a 30% turnout that you can extrapolate a potential for a general election. So I was really interested in what Mark Diffley was saying, and John Curtis agreed with a lot of it when I read his comments as well. However, I do think we do have issues. Of course we do. And I think we have to talk about this. There's a lot that the SNP, my own party, has to do. Everybody's used the excuses about why this happened. But the reality is it did happen, and we have to do our best to make sure it doesn't happen again. There's lots of different issues. There's, for example, I don't think the Scottish Government get anything like, I hesitate to use credit because times are hard just now, but the Scottish Government do a lot, for example, in alleviating some of the issues and mitigating some of the excesses of Westminster in terms of child poverty, for example, with the child payment. It never seems to get out there. We still get, the Scottish Government gets blamed, not always overtly, but by the mainstream media and press and how they report things. But I was raging this morning, I can't remember what paper it is, it might be the Herald, Sunday Herald, and they're talking about, you know, money that has to be spent, fines and all the rest of it, and mismanagement of funds by Network Rail. That's a UK government function. Yeah, it looks at first glance like the Scottish government are screwed up here. So there's all these things going on. So there's the Scottish government, and then there's the party. Our party has issues just now, and that cannot be denied. We should never be denying it. There's the ongoing police case, and that's been well talked about in many other fora. That's ongoing. We're in a bit of turmoil. We've got a governance review ongoing, thank goodness, it's long overdue. So the party has to be sorted out to the extent the public can have more confidence in our party. We have to find ways of getting the Scottish Government, the SNP Green Scottish Government's message out there. Where these two things tie in is there's an awful lot of folk bumping their gums just now about internal party matters and internal government matters, and I wish they would just shut up and realise they're part of a team, and teams work by speaking together, taking decisions and backing up your colleagues. We could do with some more of that. And then there's independence. SNP is the best way of Scotland gaining independence. That's why the other things are so important. And yes, we need a discussion going forward about how we achieve independence. I'm hoping very much that discussion can be reset somewhat after the SNP conference next week, where it will be well discussed. So there's three elements of this, the most important being independence. The other two are part of the vehicle that we use to get there, and we have to have these properly running. I could go on, but I better be quiet and let Paul say something.
Thanks, Linda, for no, your analysis was absolutely perfect there. Thank you. Paul, coming to you, do you think, did Labour win the by-election, or did the SNP lose the by-election? And if you've had a chance to reflect on it, what do you think were the factors that led to the result?
I think there's a bit of context, and probably one thing you said, Andrew, as well, is that about Renton, and don't agree with Renton. It's not shite being Scottish. It's maybe more difficult at times, but it's always good being Scottish. So, I think context is a really important thing, and obviously, with a recall election, I think that's an important context. Linda mentioned about the turnout just being 37%, and I've lots of respect for Mark and John Curtis and this, and I think they were right. I think we've got to have a level head on this, but we've got to look at the reasons about what happened. I think that the Labour win, I think, shocked us to the extent how much Labour had won it by, and I think Linda's right. There are a few things I think for me that we need to look at. And first of all, at the moment, not just in Rutherglen, but support for the party is lower, and where support for independence kind of sits. So we have to reflect on that and ask ourselves why, and look at that. So we need to convince people who support independence that the only vehicle to deliver that is through an SNP government, and I think that's spot on. So that's part of the reflection. And I think the key thing, and Linda touched on it as well, is around about, as Team SNP, divided parties never win elections. They will never win elections, and I think we were all reflecting on where we are. We've had a number of years of being in power, but we've got to make sure we continue to push towards winning the next election and making sure we win that referendum when it comes. And I think there will always be discussions within parties, but let's keep it within parties. So there's two ways for me. One is obviously the discussions about where the direction of the party comes, but it can't just be inward facing. Yes, we've got to discuss that within our branches, got to discuss that within the parliamentary groups. But we have to go out and speak to people as well, and that's the key thing. There's a message to go out to SNP members is we have to go out and speak to people and find out what's happening. The cost of living crisis is really impacting on people at the moment. There was an element of tactical voting, I think, during the Rutherglen election. I don't think we'll see it to that extent when we come to the election next year, which I think we're probably looking towards this time next year, September, October time next year. So we have time. We've got to reflect on it. We've got to be level-headed. But we've got to be aware of the challenge that there is at the moment. We've been in power a long time, since 2007. So we've got to respect that. But we've got to make sure that we're speaking to people out there and finding out exactly what their priorities are. But I'm confident we can turn this around in terms of the general election next year, and also towards 2026 when we have the Scottish Parliament elections.
Thanks, Paul. Linda, I was going to ask you a little bit. It struck me this morning, just as I was thinking about this a little bit, whether Humza Yousaf is in fact suffering some of the same challenges as Rishi Sunak. Now, that may seem a strange question. My point was that both leaders have inherited a party and inherited a government and inherited a set of policies from somebody else. And both are now encountering political headwinds. Put it that way. Is there a read across between the situation for the First Minister and the situation for the Prime Minister?
Well, I suppose we could make a read across if we chose to, but I really hesitate to even think of comparing Nicola Sturgeon with Liz Truss, Andrew. No, I'm not going to do that. I think she might seek me out if I did that. It's always difficult to take over midstream, you know, until you've actually won an election as a leader in your own right. Things are hard, and until you've worked out your own manifesto with your team and your party and gone forward and won an election in your own right, it's difficult. I remember even when Nicola Sturgeon took over from Alex Salmond post 2014. You know, from my memory, it wasn't until she won the election in her own right in 2016 that she really became very, very relaxed into the job and became the First Minister that was so admired. Humza Yousaf has had a heck of a hard time. You know, he's been dropped in as, you know, well, he wasn't dropped in, he chose to go there, I guess. But, you know, he became First Minister and also leader of a party which was going through a very hard time. Now, I have seen what Humza's trying to do. He's leading from the front in his party, and that's laudable and should be applauded. Of course it has. And he's being First Minister, and to my mind, he's doing that very well. However, what I would like to see is Humza Yousaf being First Minister and leading the government, and I would like to see others with an oversight from the party leader, of course, but I would like to see others like Keith Brown as deputy leader and other people that can be well trusted and a strong executive in our party sorting out the party and making sure it's on a firm footing towards independence. So I think the two roles, I understand why Humza Yousaf has wanted to do both, and there was a time for that. But I would like to, now that we've got the governance review almost complete, we have a really important conference this weekend. I want Humza to go away and be First Minister and do it very well. And I want the party to be sorted out by others that Humza Yousaf as party leader has trust in.
Thanks, Linda. And Paul, one final question on the by-election for you. The collapse in the SNP vote probably is one of the most striking aspects of what was a by-election. What have you had a chance to think about why you think that the SNP vote stayed at home last Thursday?
I think there are a number of reasons. I think one, and we've tiny touched on that around about where the people see the party at the moment. Is it seen as divided? I think people who raise concerns have an opportunity to raise it in the proper forums and not speaking to unionist papers. I don't think that helps at all. I think the point Linda makes around about, you know, the party itself in terms of governance is incredibly important. And I know since Murray Fruit took on the chief executive role and also Keith, there is a real focus on doing that. And there's a lot of good work I think it's going on at the moment. And I have every confidence in Murray and Keith turning that round. And I think that will, you know, reflect on that. We need to obviously get through the police investigation. And trying again, and it comes back to Linda, the point Linda mentioned, is about not getting credit as such for the things that we're doing. We just have to look at the child payment and Scottish child payment and see the difference that's making in Scotland as it is in the rest of the UK. And my own, I suppose, area in terms of housing, we build 40% more per head of population houses than England and 70% more than Wales. You know, and that's something I try and highlight all the time. Yes, we need to be building more houses, but that's how successful we've been over a number of years in that regard. So I think there's a number of things, but I think these things can be turned around relatively quickly. We do have to connect with people who didn't, you know, where independence kind of sits. And I think the last poll showed us 4% ahead, you know, in yes 52, no 48. So we have to reflect on why that's the case. But it comes back to the point, and still, it was a by-election. And I think the points that Mark Diffley and John Curtis have both made, you can't extrapolate that straight into a general election. We have to have cool heads. We need to make sure we're focusing on what we can do within party structures in terms of what the party looks like and organises itself. But we've got to get out and speak to people as well and understand what more we need to do in terms of helping them through this cost of living crisis. And I know we kind of accept it, but it's the worst cost of living crisis for at least 50 years. So inward looking and outward looking. And I'm, as I said, coming back, still confident we can do very well in the general election and in Scottish Parliament elections in 2026.
Thanks, Paul. We'll move on now and look at UK politics a little bit, because the Labour Party meets for its week's conference in Liverpool with a lot to celebrate. The party's jubilant after the by-election victory in Rutherglen and Hamilton West, and Rishi Sunak's attempt to kickstart a Tory recovery at their conference in Manchester foundered in a swamp of self-inflicted mayhem, badly executed U-turns and frantic factional fighting. All the things he was supposed to have put behind him. Labour morale will be further boosted because the party has sustained a double-digit lead in opinion polls since the implosion of Liz Truss's calamitous premiership last year. This phase of Starmer's leadership is perhaps the most critical of all, persuading the country that it needs and should desire a Labour government. We're coming to this conference bang on schedule, Starmer said. This is the conference we wanted at this stage of the journey, and this is where we intend to answer the question, why Labour? With confidence and a coherent plan. Now, that really needs answering because many voters are still unsure what Starmer is really all about and are yet to be convinced that Labour has any clear plan for the country. And of course, the central critique of Starmer from the left is that his determination to make his party less vulnerable to hostile fire from the Tories and his drive to make a Starmer government look like a safe choice for centrist voters have turned Labour into an ultra-cautious outfit, devoid of much substance and indistinguishable from the Tories, except for the colour of their ties. So, Paul, firstly, because we're lucky enough to have you on the programme today, I thought I'll ask you this specific point first, and then we can come back to the broader politics. But Starmer's deputy, Angela Rayner, who's also Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, her main focus in her speech today will be on housing, as well as pledging a decent job, a secure home and a strong community for all under the Labour government. Now, Labour didn't build much housing the last time they were in power. I think the average was 562 council houses across the whole UK every year of the new Labour project. So do you think, is there a credible offer here from Labour on this specific point round about housing?
No, I mean, I think you've seen Keir Starmer coming out this morning. I watched him saying it needed £1.5 billion a year, and he was asked what that would entail and didn't really have the answer on that. And I think down south they need to be building around about 300,000, I think it's about 330,000 houses a year to kind of keep up with the backlog that they've got. So I don't think they have a credible alternative at the moment. And I think that kind of demonstrates where we are at the moment down south. I think there's much more enthusiasm for getting rid of the Conservative government because of their inadequacies, rather than as an appetite for a Labour government. And I think that's going to be a challenge, I think, for the Labour Party over the next year as we move towards the election. And yes, they're in a strong position, but I think there's much more enthusiasm for getting rid of the Tories than there was, and than getting a Labour government. I think when we seen back when Tony Blair came into power at that time, there was enthusiasm for a Labour government then. I don't think we're anywhere near that at all. And it comes back to many of the policy changes that Keir Starmer has made or backtracked on. And I think very much what you'll continue to see over the first 2 or 3 years will the Labour Party following Tory Party policies and spending plans, which won't help us get out of the cost of living crisis in terms of and support the most vulnerable and that's the kind of key things I think we need to be highlighting in that election, is that with the powers of independence, we could change things much more quicker than we would under a Labour government, which quite frankly is going to come in and be Tory light, if you like.
Thanks, Paul. Linda, I was looking for I was also going to look to you for some wider perspective. You're not in frontline politics to the same extent nowadays, but you are you're pretty close to Rutherglen and West Hamilton, where you are just now. What do you think is Labour's offer, and in particular, what do you think is Labour's offer to Scotland?
Well, that's interesting. I think what Paul was saying really strikes me, it's, the first question you asked, Andrew, was why Labour? And the answer is because they're not the Tories. And that's the only answer people have got down south. At least in Scotland, we have alternatives. But they don't appear to have really down south. So they bring in Labour because they're not the Tories, and then they realise they've just got the Tories, actually. As far as Scotland's concerned, I think it was really interesting that the successful candidate in Rutherglen, Hamilton West, is that what it was called? I've got the new constituency names not in my brain yet. The Rutherglen by-election, Michael Shanks, and good luck to him. The boy did well. However, he was not averse to speaking against Starmer. We talked about divided parties earlier. He said he would argue with Starmer about the EU. He said he would argue with Starmer about the two-child cap. So we'll see how that pans out when he goes down, because there will be the proof of whether Labour will be different. Will be if those like Mr. Shanks decide that they're really not happy with the U-turns that Starmer has made. Will they be reset, or will we just carry on? As far as Scotland's concerned, I think it'll be a problem if Labour are too strong in Scotland, because they've very, very clearly sided with the Tories and kept up the Better Together campaign. They are quite happy to see devolution being watered down. They're quite happy to deny the right of a Scottish Parliament to make its own decisions. They have already refused over and over and over again, for example, the devolution of employment law. Now that's a really big deal. Scotland could do so much better if we had rights over employment law, be the kind of society that I believe most people in Scotland want to see. But the promises that Starmer is making, to me, don't tie in the bigger picture. He's talking about all these affordable houses. I don't even know if they're saying affordable houses that they're going to build across England. Scotland's already doing very well in that regard, and I'm sure Paul McLennan has the figures at the tips of his fingers. But he talks about that. But then on the other hand, we know there are skill shortages. In the construction industry, we know there are shortages. So on one hand, he's saying we're going to build all these houses. On the other hand, they're carrying on the Tory policy of limiting free movement that very often lets us get enough skills in. So I don't think they're joined up particularly. It'll be interesting to see the implementation plans once all the headline announcements have been made at the conference.
Thanks, Linda. And Paul, one of the points that we've been discussing is round about this answer to the question why Labour, and it not really, and there being an argument that it's not really particularly clear why Labour at the moment, and the TUC have joined in by accusing Labour of being too timid. So do you think, does that leave a space for the SNP to be bolder in their policies and clearer about the policy platform and on independence to contrast their position with a very timid and very beige Labour Party?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things to look at that. I think with the election, Westminster election coming up, we have to show what the powers of independence would give us over where the current devolution powers are. And we've already seen Keir Starmer backtracking a number of issues, employment laws, as Linda mentioned, the two-child cap, which they would retain, but would do it more humanely, whatever that means. I mean, that's just a ridiculous position to be in. And ironically, we see the position we have the Welsh Labour Party stand up for Scottish devolution more than the Scottish Labour Party. And Mark Drakeford has come out and mentioned that a number of times about protecting devolution, and yet we have the Labour Party, the Scottish Labour Party, siding with the UK government on some of these matters. So I think there's what we need to do between now and the election, Westminster election, is point out some of the things that we've done, but point out already in this devolved Parliament, but with the restrictions, but then look around at what the powers of independence would bring. But I think then, if you're then talking beyond that, from Westminster to the 2026 election, Scottish Labour has nowhere to turn. They'll have their own government if Keir Starmer comes in then, and we'll see a Labour government, which I said will be Tory light. And I think that highlights, I think, a real opportunity for us to again highlight the difference that the Scottish Parliament has made, the Scottish government has made, and with full powers of independence, what we could do leading up to 2026. So they may think they're in a good position just now. Come a Westminster election, then the Labour Party, the Scottish Labour Party, are going to have to be in a real position to try and change and deliver on some of the promises that they've said to the Scottish people, which I don't think they can.
Thanks, Paul. Now, we'll continue to look at SNP politics a little bit, because as the SNP conference approaches next weekend, what do the SNP need to do to change? To reverse Thursday's by-election result and the latest polling? Support for independence remains around 50%, despite the media declaring independence is over. And as Paul said, independence is polling higher than the SNP. So at the SNP's annual conference this week, the by-election loss and issues of how to win back or to mobilise support will be dominating the discussions, particularly around the strategy on independence. Tony Giuliano, the party's policy development convener, said that while it was only one by-election, there was a need to take heed of the result and look at a change of approach and how to remotivate SNP supporters. To me, we need to do two things now. We need to restore trust and we need to remotivate our support, he told The National. It is clear our support stayed home, and in terms of trust, we went into the by-election resulting from a disgraced MP, but also with one hand behind our backs because of a live police investigation where we haven't been able to utter a word on the matter. He added, "We can't achieve independence in an election if we don't have strong support for the SNP. How do we enthuse independent supporters How do we enthuse independent supporters to back the SNP in this election? We have a lot of thinking to do on that." He went on, "We need to realise we need a different approach here. This is not business as usual, and we can't go on as normal. We need to get tougher in some of our messaging and inspire. This is the kick we need to get our act together as a party and a movement to make ourselves relevant and put independence on the agenda." So, Linda, quite a lot in that from Tony Giuliano, who's, as I say, is currently the SNP's policy development convener, and I think is putting himself forward to stand at the next Westminster by-election. I think he's seeking selection as a candidate. I just can't remember in which constituency. Probably in Dumbartonshire somewhere. Falkirk, thank you. Falkirk. There we go. Thanks, Linda. So, do you think is Tony right? Is this the kick that the SNP needs in order to remotivate supporters and to put independence back on the agenda?
Hey, maybe it's the final kick. We've had quite a few kicks lately, and with the different kicks we've had, we have started to do things. So, this isn't oh gosh, this is a terrible moment. It's right, we're not out of the woods yet. We have to keep going and make the changes we have. So generally he's right. And, one of the things I would pick up on is I think we've been too cautious in an awful lot of ways about some of the big things. I think I can say things now, being retired brings a wonderful freedom. I think we're screwed up in quite a few things. And I wouldn't deny that. There's things we could have done better. But I think there's also things that we have shied away from. And the biggie for me is land reform. I don't think we've been radical enough on land reform. And everything that includes, things like land value tax, for example. We're still footering about with council taxes and not really looking at land value tax. So I think there's a lot that we could really bite the bullet with and move forward in a more radical way. And as far as the independence question is concerned, it's back to, I think, how we all agreed in the starting this programme, that the vehicles for independence have to be firmly in place. So in order for people to trust us, ergo trust that we can move forward to independence and it being something that people actively want, because that's what we need. We need people to want independence. We have to recognise that we need a strong, very Scottish-focused government, which we have in the SNP. And we also have to recognise that we have a party that people trust. And these two things working together become the vehicle for independence. And I think people will trust us more if they see the big things being tackled, the big things that have blighted Scotland for a long, long time. There's also the issue of getting the message out there. And I think the party has to look very carefully, and the government indeed, look very carefully at their operations and make sure that the truth is getting out there. That the truth is getting out there to what the Scottish Government is achieving and what independence can bring. And how we're being held back by others, because that doesn't often get out there either. Some of the reporting is not great. Unfortunately, we don't have a funded mainstream Scottish TV channel, really. We could do with something like that, and we could do with supporting something like that. And here we are here talking about Scotland for an hour. That's the kind of thing that should be embraced by both our party and the Scottish Government, and indeed those who believe Scotland's got a really good future.
Thanks, Linda. Paul, one thing crossed my mind. In Scotland, we've had a great deal of democracy over the last decade. We've had an election or a referendum every year, apart from this year, and I wondered whether there might be an element here that voters in Scotland are exhausted or are scunnered with so much democracy, in a sense, or are staying home because they're focusing on a cost of living crisis, which, as you say, is the most severe in living memory.
No, I think there's a bit of both. If you speak to people on the doorsteps, then the cost of living crisis, and certainly the casework we get through focuses a lot on that. So there is that focus, and there is that balance. I think in terms of, you see this across all the political parties, the same. I don't think there's the same level of enthusiasm for politics in terms of getting activists out, and I think that's a challenge. And we need to make sure we motivate activists to get out and do that. The only way we're going to do that is and I think, is enthusiasm about the message we're trying to get across there. And it comes back to, I think, the point we talked about before. There are two key things, I think, for me. One, how do we make sure that people who are supporting independence, we convince them that the only way and the only vehicle to do that is through the SNP. If they're lending their vote or whatever way to Labour are not going to give them the independence that we require. But we also got to remember, opinion polls are about 50-50. We still got to persuade people who remain unconvinced that we still need to get who are currently not voting for us or voting for independence. We need to get them, make sure that they're doing that as well. So we've got to make sure it's not just about independent supporters, it's that those who are still swithering. We need to get 55-60% in terms of that and make sure we're going to win. I think we've got to focus very much on what we're looking at in terms of a tough spending round. What are the key priorities? And for me, it has to be tackling poverty and supporting the most vulnerable in our society. But I think Linda's right in terms of how people look at the SNP as well, in terms of, are we seen as divided? I think that some of the things that have been kind of going out, yes, it is looked upon that. We've got to have good governance. Any government, and regardless of what it say, has to have good governance. And I think, when you look at some policy implementation plans, it's not gone the way it should have been. So, and I know Humza's very focused on good delivery, and I think we'll start to see that come through with some of the policies in terms of that. And I was right, when I done a summer tour, going around as many local authorities, and we've got a rural housing action plan coming out in a number of weeks. And one of the key things that came through, and what's the restriction around about trying to build more houses in the Highlands, in rural areas, is land reform. And we just look at the ownership in terms of where that is in the Highlands, for example. So we do need to be more radical in terms of where we are. We are the only party that will do that. You're not going to get radical policies coming from the Labour Party, and certainly not from the Tories. So it's a combination of both. But we need, when it comes back to it, we need level heads. There needs to be discussions, not just at conference, but ongoing, about how we look at that. So I think NEC will have a key role in that, as will branches. So we need to make sure we're speaking to our branches as well. So it's a time for level heads, I think. But when you look at about what we've still been through, and we've still got independence for support at 50%, I think that's incredible. And it comes back to, we have a press that's not balanced at all. Of course, they're entitled to their opinion, but we don't have a balanced press. And that if you looked at any other country and reflected on why we're in the position we are as a governing party for that period of time, it's incredible. Because we've never had a balanced press in terms of where we sit. We have 50-50% in terms of independence, and we've got the national and other, and obviously yourselves, in terms of broadcast and print, as the only groups that can get out there, along with other small groups. But it's incredible we're in the position we are when we have such a biased press.
Thanks, Paul. Now, our final item this afternoon is a reflection that probably the most significant outcome from the Tory party conference in Manchester last week was the cancellation of most of HS2. The £36 billion which would have been spent on the high-speed rail link north of Birmingham will now supposedly be spent all over the UK. Rishi Sunak said, "We will deliver HS2 between Birmingham and Euston as planned, but we will extend it no further. Instead, we will take every pound that would have been spent extending HS2 and invest over £36 billion into Network North, a new programme of transport improvements that will benefit far more people in far more places far quicker." Now, the list of projects in Network North under Scotland includes improvements to the A1 between Newcastle and Berwick and to the M6 in Cumbria. And to be fair, those are important freight routes for Scotland. Only two of the projects are actually in Scotland, improving the A75 between Dumfries and Stranraer and the A77 in Ayrshire, both of which are important road links for Northern Ireland. Improving rail connections and showing competence in getting big transport infrastructure delivered had been promoted by Westminster as part of union connectivity and part of the argument against Scottish independence. So firstly, Paul, because we've got you here and the A1 goes through your constituency, I thought it was worthwhile just to reflect that part of Sunak's promise is a long-awaited upgrade to part of the A1. I'm reminded that in 1996, Tony Blair said he would be very happy to see an upgrade to the A1, but in 2002, a major study decided there was not enough traffic to justify an upgrade. In 2004, Alistair Darling defended the decision not to upgrade the A1, saying, "Remember, there are other things which can be done. Money can be spent on encouraging people to drive safely." And then in January 2017, Chris Grayling said the A1 would be dualled from Northumberland to Scotland, but admitted there was no timetable for the improvement. And he said that a project to dual the whole road would be chaos, but said that dualling the A1 continued to be a priority. So, Paul, in terms of this supposed Network North proposal, do you think there's any prospect of seeing the A1 dualled anywhere north of Newcastle anytime soon?
Andrew, I remember when I was council leader, I spoke and met a few councils from the northeast of England talking about the A1. We struggled to get any discussions with the UK government at all on the matter, and I think at the time that was important. The key thing, I think, for me, obviously, and it's important to freight, but the key thing for me would be I know Network Rail and other Transport Scotland are looking at options around about a 4-track solution between Newcastle and Edinburgh, and about increasing capacity, about trying to get more freight off the road and onto rail, and obviously increasing capacity within that. So for me, the main focus would be how can we make sure there's more expansion on the East Coast as well as the West Coast. In terms of that, talking about capacity coming into Scotland, and that's meeting our climate change obligations, but also in terms of trying to bring more people to Scotland in terms of business, in terms of commuters as well. I think that's the key. That would be the key focus for me, and I'm going to write to the UK government on that matter. We need to be looking how we support that. So things have changed since then. So for me, it would be more a focus on increasing capacity between Newcastle and Edinburgh. And that would include freight. So I think that would be the key focus in that regard for myself. But it comes back, Andrew.
Go on.
Sorry, Andrew. One key thing as well, and I think this is where, again, the policy that Linda talked about, Network Rail is under the control of the UK government. It needs to be under the control of the Scottish government as well, because we've got ScotRail. We need Network Rail in terms of Scotland brought back under Scotland here.
Thanks, Paul. And Linda, I was going to ask you a broader question. What do you think the cancellation of most of HS2 north of Birmingham, what do you think that means for Scotland, either in practical terms or in political terms?
Well, I think it means quite a lot. In practical terms, they scrapped the Scottish leg of this way back some years ago, so we were aware of that. However, the one that was carrying on from Birmingham to Manchester was going to have a link up with the West Coast lines. So, shorter journey times, etc. So that has a direct impact straight away. We've then got the complete lack of infrastructure over the decades from UK governments. It's just been exacerbated with this. But what it's also doing is keeping that reliance, particularly with business people, etc., on short-haul flights. So again, it's a mark of the sort of anti-environment with the Tories. You know, that they're just not doing anything, you know, on the green agenda, if you like. They seem to have decided that that's a bad word and they're not doing it. There's another issue here. They're saying that this money is going to be spent here, there and everywhere. Again, Starmer hasn't said anything particular. So they're going to have all sorts of legal wrangles about this. This isn't going to just be, oh, look, we've got all this money now and we can spend it. They've actually, I mean, they've bought up properties and land and all sorts for this HS2 thing, you know, up that route. So it's not going to be just a case of, no, that's fine, we're not spending. They're going to have things to sell on. There's going to be all sorts of legal wrangles. This could go on for years and years and years. What's the bet? And there'll be a public inquiry and it'll be 10 years down the line before it even actually responds to anything. So the implications for Scotland are business as usual, which is our powerhouse is London in the southeast. The rest of you, north of England, Scotland, you don't actually matter to us. So we're not doing anything to improve things for you. We're keeping the money where the money is. And actually, I don't see London Labour doing anything about that either. So business as usual for Scotland as far as Westminster is concerned.
Thank you, Linda. Great advice as always. Follow the money, as always. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to develop the station and to make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. However, the generosity of our supporters has given us a little more time. So far, we've raised over £18,600 and so we will be able to continue making programmes for a few more weeks, but our need to raise the remaining £11,400 is still really urgent. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Broadcast Scot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. We will be back at 7 p.m. sharp tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching us this afternoon, and of course I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special two guests, to Linda Fabiani and to Paul McLennan MSP. Thanks guys.
Thanks, Andrew.
Please look after yourselves and please have a very peaceful rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McLennan.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.